Okay, hi everyone. So I'm here today to talk about building an offline page for theguardian.com. My name is Oliver Ash. You can find me on Twitter at this handle, Oliver J. Ash. So at The Guardian, I used to work on the content management system called Composer, which you can see here. This is a web-based application built in Angular. And it's a tool that all of our journalists use to publish content to the web and also to the newspaper. And this is what I work on now. I work on theguardian.com for anyone who's not seen it. I do full stack development, A/B testing features, just trying to increase our loyal user base. I want to start talking about how web and native compare when it comes to offline and poor connectivity performance. On a native app, when you open the app, the content will be fetched from the network and cached. So the next time you visit and you're offline, well, you're going to see the stale content that's being cached from your previous visit. As you can see, that's what the Guardian app does here. So I'm offline, but I can still see all the articles. I can still go into an article. If the server's down, well, the same thing, right? I'm just going to see the stale content. If I have a poor connection, then I'll see the stale content, and the native app will try to get the new content. It will probably take a while, though. And if I have a good connection, then it's going to do the same thing, but the new content is going to arrive much faster. We all know these things because we all use native apps every day. But on the web, well, if you're offline and you go to theguardian.com, you just get this really bad offline experience. It does have a game to play if you tap on the dinosaur, which kind of helps a little bit, but it's not as good as getting the real content. If the server's down, then you're gonna have the same thing. You're gonna see the offline page. If you have a poor connection, it's kind of worse because you'll just be staring at a white screen while the content tries to load. And if you have a good connection, then finally we have the happy path. We're gonna see the content that we came for. And I think the offline page in Chrome is becoming somewhat a symbol. This is actually an advertisement in the capital of Argentina that's showing the offline page. I'm not sure what the advertisement actually says, but it illustrates the point that people were used to seeing this when they tried to use the web and they're offline. But it's 2016, and I think we can probably do better. So of all those things that we just talked about, offline, poor connectivity, we wanted to try and improve on that. We started by building an offline page. So I'm on theguardian.com, and I'm going to go offline. And as you can see, I get an offline page. It also has a crossword you can play as a little Easter egg, but I'm not very good at those, so maybe you can have a go. You can try this if you go to theguardian.com/info/developer blog. You'll be able to do what you just saw there, and you'll be able to try the offline page for yourself. So I really want to emphasize that what you just saw, the prototype was built in less than a day. I'm going to talk about how I did that and some of the problems that I came across, but I want you to remember that everything that's shown here, you can add to your website as a progressive enhancement, and it really won't take you that long. So how does the offline page work? I'm going to talk about this in 4 steps. And the first one is creating and registering a service worker. We've already had an introduction today to service workers, thanks to Patrick. But I'm just going to briefly reiterate what a service worker is. So, and I think it's kind of funny, actually, like the number of times that service workers are mentioned at conferences nowadays. Chrome Dev Summit, which I was at last year, I think someone counted it was mentioned 66.5 times, and an honorable 0.5 for the plural mention of web workers. So what is a service worker? Well, primarily it's a script that runs in the background. And that's useful for features that require no user interaction. So that might be listening to push events and showing a notification when a breaking news event happens, for example. Or it might be intercepting and handling network requests, which is something we'll be using later to build the offline page. And in the future, it will be extended to do other things like background sync. If you have some data that you want to update periodically, or you have an alarm that you want to remind a user to do something and show a notification. And also geofencing, so when you enter a geographical perimeter, perform some action. And a service worker is a progressive enhancement, so without it, the website just works as it did before. And it requires HTTPS, and as Patrick's demonstrated earlier, the support at the moment is only Chrome, Opera, and Firefox. And Edge are working on it. Safari maybe next decade, hopefully. So for the observant amongst you, you might know that we are not HTTPS on The Guardian. And I just said that service worker is a requirement. HTTPS is a requirement for service worker. But we are migrating, and we've actually already migrated some sections of the website. The reason why we're doing this slowly is primarily because of advertising. So we have a lot of advertising networks which aren't ready for HTTPS yet. That might be because they don't serve HTTPS, or something within their network doesn't serve HTTPS. But we're migrating section by section, and we're looking at the data to see whether it's having any impact on our revenue. And so far, it looks good. I think pretty soon we're going to be ready to go HTTPS entirely. So the first step, as I said, was creating and registering a service worker. So here we just do, if the service worker is supported, then we'll register a service worker. So just imagine we've created an empty file at the root of our website called service-worker.js. So if you serve this HTML, and the next visit to your website will be routed through the service worker. So we have a service worker, but it's currently not really doing anything. Just a quick note, if you want to see whether you have one installed, you can go into Chrome DevTools, go to the resources panel, and then select service workers down the left-hand side. And likewise in Firefox, you can go to about debugging hash workers. So we have a service worker. Now we need to use it. And we want to prime the cache. We want to download some resources which we're going to use later on to show the offline page. And for that, we have an install event. So once the browser has registered the service worker, it will run this install event. And in here, we just call event.waitUntil, and we give that a promise. So the service worker will only successfully install if that promise succeeds. In this code, we're calling a function called updateCache, which uses a new cache API. It opens a cache with a name that has today's date in it, which we'll use later on for versioning. And we're just going to cache some HTML for the offline page. We're going to cache some CSS, which we need to style the page, and some JavaScript. The crossword, which you saw on the offline page, is a React application, so that's all going to be cached in that JavaScript. So now we have a service worker and we have a cache, but we're still not really doing anything with it. So how can we start using the things we have cached? Well, as I said earlier, one of the things you can do with a service worker is you can handle and intercept requests. And the way you do this is using the fetch event. So here, this is just the code you saw earlier. I've added a little bit on the end for the fetch event. And here I'm just overriding what the browser would do whenever a request comes through. But I'm actually just doing the default, which is to use the fetch function to go to the network and get the data. But you could do anything in this event. You could bypass the network altogether and go straight to the cache, or you could construct your own response. So now we have a fetch event, and all requests will be routed through the service worker. It's still not that useful, but we're taking baby steps here. So to give you an idea of the flexibility that you have, you can actually programmatically construct a response. So here in this example, I have a string of HTML, which is just hello world in a H1. And I can say new response, and if I give it that string and I tell it what content type it is, then I can actually respond with that. So in a way, it's almost like your service worker it feels like a server, right? You're deciding what to respond with, and you can programmatically construct that. So we've seen that we can use the fetch event to decide how we want to respond to the browser when it makes a request. To do the offline page, we actually have to break this down into two sections. One is HTML, and the second section is CSS and JavaScript. And that's because we actually have different cache strategies for these type of assets. HTML is mutable, so a given URL, either theguardian.com or theguardian.com/offline page, the content changes. So we only cache that for 60 seconds. But CSS and JavaScript, we version those. So if you request some CSS, you'll always get that same CSS back. So for HTML, when the user makes a request and they're offline, we want to show the offline page. We don't really want to show the offline page if they request an image and they're offline. So for HTML, what we want to do is we want to go to the network first. And if there's an error, then we'll see if there's something in the cache that we can use instead. This pattern is known as network first, then cache. So this is pretty much the same code that you saw before for the fetch event. Here I've just guarded the response to say only do this if the request that's coming through is HTML. And the way we know that is by looking at the accept header. The accept has it's a string that tells you what content types the browser will accept for this given request. That's not that useful in itself. So the thing we'll do next, as I said, we want to go to the network first and then to the cache. So here's the code we had before. And if fetch fails, well, fetch is a promise, so that will just return a rejected promise. We can catch that promise rejection, and we can decide to go we can decide to handle that error and retrieve something from the cache. In this case, we're going to return the offline page. So if you're offline, the fetch function will error and will be returning the offline page. So now, if you're offline, you'll get this, which isn't a very pretty offline page. And that's because we still need to handle assets. As I said, these are immutable, so we want to handle these requests separately. So the first thing we'll do is, if a request for CSS or JavaScript comes through, we'll just go straight to the cache. How do we do that? Well, we're already handling HTML, so let's just say any other request that comes through, respond with, we'll look in the cache to see if there's a matching item for the request that's coming through. So this is what we have, but that won't work if you request something which isn't in the cache. So we're caching some CSS and some JavaScript for the offline page, but you have to remember that all other requests are going to be coming through this fetch event. So we actually want to take an approach more like this, which is we'll go to the network, we'll go to the server, and if that fails, we'll go to the cache first, and if that fails, then we'll fall back to the network. And this pattern is known as cache first, then network. So here's the code that you saw previously. Caches.match returns a promise. And the value of that promise will be undefined if there was no result in the cache. So we'll return the response if there is one, otherwise we'll go to the network. So the next part for the offline page is updating the crossword. We actually publish new crosswords every day, and it would be nice if the offline page, when you saw it, had the latest available crossword. But also, we also need to update the cached entries because we make style changes to the website. For example, if we redesigned the header, we would want you to see that in your offline page. So the way we do that is we check to see if the cache is up to date or not. And we know if the cache is up to date because we stored our cached assets given a cache name which had today's date in it. So if there isn't a cache with today's name in, then we know it's not up to date. And if it's not up to date, then we'll just run that same function we saw earlier, which was the update cache function, and then clear out the old cache. The actual implementation of this isn't that important, which is why I faded out the details, but these will be available online if you want to check that out. But in the future, the better way to do this would be to use the background sync API, which allows you to periodically update some data. So we might want to say, every morning, see if there's a new crossword. This code is actually living in the global scope of the crossword, so global scope of the service worker, sorry. So every time this global scope runs, this code will run. And that actually happens quite frequently because the browser closes a service worker and brings it back when you make a request to save memory. So we have an offline page that now it has CSS and JavaScript, and everything works. I want to briefly talk about what we might use Service Worker for on The Guardian in the future. The offline page right now is kind of insignificant because not many browsers support Service Worker, and we're not fully HTTPS ready. But that's going to change. That's going to change pretty fast. So it will increase in significance. And I think we should extend it to do, like you saw earlier, if you're offline, we could show stale content, like native apps do. Or we could do better. We could, we know what you've read recently, so we could download personalized content ahead of time. So when you're on the tube to work, you read the 10 articles that we think you might like. We also have a save for later feature, which could be, which we could use to for the user to say, I want to read this offline. But there's also something called offline first, which is something we could explore. And I just briefly want to demonstrate what that might look like. So the idea of offline first is that you should render as much as you can without the network. So that might mean when you go to theguardian.com and you're offline, you just instantly respond with a shell of the page, which you have cached. And you might decide to show some stale content as well. And that not only improves the experience for users who are offline, but also for users who have poor connectivity, because as soon as they go to your website, they're going to get a response instantly, which means you're not staring at a white screen anymore. So just to kind of demonstrate what that would look like, this is what going to theguardian.com looks like today. If you're on a poor connection, you could be staring at this for 5-10 minutes if you're on a really bad connection, at which point you're going to give up. But if you did what I was just saying, which is to cache a shell of the page and also maybe cache some stale content, this is what it would look like as soon as you go to the website and you have poor connectivity or you're offline. You'll see this immediately. And I think it also improves not only the first visit, but second page views. So currently, if I tap on a link and I have poor connectivity, nothing will happen until that content has downloaded, and then the browser will render it. And sometimes you actually see users tapping on links 4 or 5 times because the browser hasn't given them any feedback that something's happened. But if we did offline first, well, they would tap on it, and you would instantly get some feedback until the content arrives. We could replace a spinner here with like a skeleton of the page, which people are starting to do now. But that's just to give you an idea of what offline first might look like. So when I was building the offline page, I had a few problems. One was browser bugs. So Service Worker is a new API, and browsers rely on people like me and others to use the new technology and to iron out browser bugs. I think the one in Chrome was like HTTPS to HTTP redirects would result in a view of the offline page. And Firefox there was a bug in Firefox whereby cookies were dropped, so users on HTTPS sections of the website couldn't post a comment. But we were able to work around those bugs, and I think they are fixed in the latest versions of those browsers, which is really good. Another issue we had was, so we use a CDN to cache all requests, and we had some interleaving of versions. And I'm just going to briefly explain what I mean by that, because I think other people might run into this issue when they start caching stuff with Service Worker. So serviceworker.js, when the browser runs it, it says cache the offline page and cache some CSS. And the offline page, when you run it, it will depend on that CSS which has been cached. So from the CDN point of view, when someone makes a request for the Service Worker, the CDN will say, OK, I'm going to cache this for 60 seconds. And we have the first version of the Service Worker cached. Likewise, when someone makes a request for the offline page, the CDN will cache that for 60 seconds. Likewise for the CSS. But with the CSS, we cache that for a year because it's an immutable asset. But at some point in the future, someone's going to do a deploy, and the Service Worker, which the CDN has cached for 60 seconds, will fall out of the cache, and the new one will come in. Which means you end up in a situation like this, where you have the new Service Worker, which says, OK, cache the offline page and cache the CSS, but the CDN still has the old version of the offline page. So when you try to run the offline page, it's going to be asking for some CSS which you haven't got cached. So it's quite a fiddly problem to have. The way we solved it was using something like a cache manifest. So as you saw earlier, when in the install event, rather than saying cache the offline page and some HTML and some CSS, we say go to offlinepage.json, and offlinepage.json will tell you what HTML you need and what assets you need. So you can guarantee that there won't be no interleaving of versions in the CDN cache. Alternatively, you could actually version the offline page HTML, but we couldn't do that for tooling reasons. OK, so why did I build the offline page? Well, I have to admit, it's fun to play around with new technology. And as I said earlier, it has got insignificant usage due to the HTTPS and browser support at the moment. But I think it's really good to plant the seed, and I think a lot of people don't realize that the web is going to be able to do this. It already can to some extent, but over the next few years, the web can really start to compete with native. And as I said earlier, it's good to do these things because it does help to iron out browser bugs. I was able to find bugs in Chrome and Firefox, and I think they are now fixed. And I really like this quote by Nolan Norson. If you're only going to use really old features, then you can't really expect to live in a world in the future where you have all the features you want. You need to start using these today in a progressively enhanced way, and browsers will start to realize that we need those features. So in conclusion, service workers allow us to progressively enhance the user experience for users who are offline, but also users with poor connections. And it's really, really easy to build an offline page. As I said, I built it in less than a day. I think an offline page is a really good place to start with a service worker as well, because it can live separately from the rest of your website. It doesn't require any re-architecting of your website. And my slides are available at this URL. I'll tweet the link out as well. There's a really good introduction to service workers, which I would recommend, by Alex Russell, who works on the Google team. And you can check out the Guardian service worker if you go to theguardian.com/service-worker.js. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for having me.